Welcome to the State of Mind virtual speaker series. This series has been developed to provide education and support to youth, caregivers, and educators during this challenging time. This series is a collaboration between two local nonprofits, One in Five and MindPeace, and various community mental health partners. We're glad you're here to educate yourself and to learn how to keep your brain in a healthy state of mind.
Welcome. My name is Dan Nelson. I'm a child psychiatrist, and I want to thank One in Five and MindPeace for inviting me to speak in this series about grief and loss in caregivers and being part of the One in Five speaker series that I think are here to help us to cope with the challenges of COVID virus and pandemic. Grief and loss as a topic seems particularly relevant at this time because so many of us have been challenged by losses. As a child psychiatrist, I've also been working with the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, the Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center, and the Center for Health and Innovative Learning. And in each of those contexts, I have a pretty robust opportunity to work with children and family members pretty much of all ages. I think it's important to recognize that loss and grief and bereavement is intrinsically a natural part of everyone's life. At times, I think we would like to forget about that being an aspect of our humanity, and maybe even just as a requirement for being a life form on this planet. And when I say loss, I'm not just talking about death and dying. I'm also talking about when we are challenged by other forms of losses. Those can be losses of our ability to function. They can be losses in terms of missing someone we care about, a decreased contact with them. It can be loss in terms of our sense of security and our wish to be invulnerable. And it can be a loss of, in some cases, our autonomy or our feelings of being safe and secure, even in our own homes. And unfortunately, because a virus is so small and because it's so clear that a pandemic can affect the whole world, not just a home, a house, a community, it's really affecting everyone right now. It's probably important to point out that when we talk about these losses, they can occur in so many different forms, and they can be so challenging. And the challenges are quite different when we face an event like this when we're very young versus early childhood versus a teenager versus even college age, adult, parent. And of course, COVID is particularly challenging for the elderly right now because of an increased susceptibility and vulnerability that they're experiencing to the virus. It occurs to me that it's worth noting that in each of those developmental levels, the response or the signs of grief and loss and even bereavement can be quite different. It's always impressed me that very young children tend to be very resilient, and they can show signs and symptoms of being anxious, upset. They can have disrupted sleep, they can have difficulty eating, they can look quite distressed, and really just in a few moments or minutes afterward, they can look quite happy and engaging and playing. And many people have mistakenly perceived that when a child is able to move back and forth between those challenges, that they're maybe not experiencing loss, when in fact they can have profound loss. It's just they're really good at moving back and forth from playful activities, learning activities, and feeling quite challenged and maybe even desperate. It's also true that academic and athletic and interactive social skills can really go down during a time of stress. Certainly, I think most of us have experienced that since the virus kind of moved throughout the world in the past 3 to 5 months. As children get older, they have more and more of a concept of what's going on. They get a more elaborate sense of what it is to be challenged by illness and death and dying, and I think they begin to also better understand their own mortality and the mortality of people around them, especially their significant others. Many of the children I work with have a very a deep and close relationship with their grandparents, and I think for those children, especially who have caregivers as a fundamental part of their day-to-day, the notion of COVID being a threat to the elderly is particularly challenging. As we get into adulthood, I think there is kind of a thing that happens in the mind and even the body where chronic stress begins to wear us down. We might see our sleep affected. We might find that we're more irritable. We're more likely to have stressful interactions with people we care about. We might have difficulty sleeping. And there are things that can make that even worse or more challenging. Consumption of alcohol or drugs can be particularly profound. And it's not just necessarily the things we often think about. For instance, large amounts of caffeine. I've worked with individuals who were in the emergency response, firemen, EMTs, people who work in emergency rooms, and often they'll consume, a whole liter of soft drinks or a pot of coffee almost every day, and in a way it keeps them going. But unfortunately, that level of caffeine really jazzes up the nervous system and makes it difficult to process how we best cope with feelings of loss and thoughts of our own mortality. So what does that process look like? If you think about what happens, if one of us was to have an accident or something bad happened on the way home from school or work, who would we want to be with? Who would we right away want to call? And what would we do in that phone call? So if you think about it, we want to speak to someone we know, love, and trust, especially if they're someone who we know will care about us. And that narrative, talking about our experience, talking about what it felt like, talk about what we went through, is a big part of that early narrative. If you've ever had the misfortune to wear a cast, when you first get that on and you talk about whatever event might have caused that injury, you're pretty happy to share those feelings. But as time goes on, after you've told that story 10 or 12 or 15 or 50 times, it's no longer fun or interesting for the person telling the story, even though people who were unaware of that are quite fascinated by it. So there is this kind of extinction of support that happens with that. And of course, if things are extreme, we're also worried that reflecting or talking about these events can be a traumatic trigger. So it's important to recognize that there is a normal response to acute stress, and it can feel very unsettling if it's unfamiliar to you. So it can decrease our ability to feel balanced, to feel connected, to feel like we have a clear idea of what's going to come next, and that can be very unsettling. So normal individuals, normal children, normal adults will sometimes think about worries about the future, insecurities, and even having nightmares can be a normal, healthy response to a stressful event. I might mention, as adults who take care of children, it's important to know that our processing that information is really quite different than how children need to process that. And as an example of this, I'll tell you that, if I'm in a situation where this crisis has challenged my finances and I'm worried about making a house payment, or do we have enough money for health care or whatever, if I process that out loud and I reveal to young children this deep distress, that in itself, having the world feel like it's out of control, amplifies the child's feeling of distress. Because if the adults are pretty upset, they're pretty sure they should be upset. I would liken this to if we were on an airplane and for some reason the intercom was left on, and you heard the pilot and the co-pilot begin to talk about, hey, and if you heard distress in their voice, hey, do we really have enough fuel? Did you get enough sleep last night? I don't think pilots and co-pilots have that conversation very often, let's hope. But if I was to be, back there in coach listening to this, it would be extraordinarily upsetting to me. And I think that's the kind of thing children go through when they see parents or caregivers in a lot of distress. Now, there is a threshold that each of us can cross where that distress becomes so intense, or maybe because of a genetic vulnerability or a previous challenge with mental health, we can kind of get swept up in an undertow. The undertow being the emotional experience of an acute event like COVID pandemic. And in that case, things can cross over into a threshold where it becomes difficult to function. And that might include feeling a significant amount of physical distress, possibly even your body feeling like it's warning you about some kind of physical problem. What would be normally maybe just some heartburn after eating suddenly becomes a concern about, am I having a heart attack, or is my heart healthy? It can also evolve into panic attacks. It can evolve into fears of death and dying. And again, if the loss of functioning is profound, where it's hard to get up in the morning, it's hard to interact, it's hard to go to work, and certainly if an individual, young or old, begins to talk about suicide or wishing they were dead, those are signs that professional help is really needed and acutely needed. Unfortunately, individuals who are contemplating suicide, it's often and mostly not a well thought out event. It's a highly impulsive event. When we've researched that the average individual only thinks about suicide for maybe 7 minutes before they might try to hurt themselves. So in making the environment more safe, it's important to recognize, first of all, if you talk to that individual about suicide or about their feelings, it does not amplify their distress. It in fact calms the individual. There's lots of research that shows as we discuss these things with a person who is experiencing them, they begin to feel support, they begin to think in a healthier way, and it also in that interchange, you begin to get more information as to whether there's an acute problem or not. So many of the children I work with, because I work on an intensive care unit, a psychiatric intensive care unit, so I see children and adolescents every day who come in who are suicidal. And part of the plan in working with them is for them to have this ability to talk to their family about what they're feeling and what thoughts enter their mind, and that it's okay to ask for help and support. And also that the people around this individual, they can do an awful lot to help protect that individual by making it harder to access anything that one might use to harm themselves. Knives, medications, scissors. And at first that seems like an insurmountable task. How do I put all the sharps in my home away so that this person can't access them? Because I use so many things every day. And in fact, if you think about it, even though we might use something like a cutting knife on a daily basis to prepare food, we don't really use it throughout the day. So a fairly inexpensive way to protect everyone is to take those objects and medications and maybe put them in a metal tool chest that's fairly secure and has a lock for it. Now, research has also shown there's an exception to this, and unfortunately it's firearms. Research has shown if a firearm is in the home, the family is 13 to 17 times more likely to be injured. The people who live in the home, the people who we care about, are more likely to be harmed by the firearm. And the chances of being hurt by a intruder actually are fortunately quite low in the United States. Firearms are more closely associated with children playing with a gun and accidentally hurting themselves or others, with people who are angry or sad and a quick impulse to harm themselves or others. And again, drugs and alcohol there's no problem so bad that drugs and alcohol can't make it worse. So that's a very, very risky situation if there's substance abuse in the house or even acute intoxication and access to a firearm. Um, we often recommend that people who really want to have a gun, that they find a place that's secure away from the home. Um, Maybe a trusted friend who could store it, maybe a storage unit, but something away, completely away from the friends and family. Another issue I might bring up is that when we look at the research and what we know scientifically about treating um, anxiety and depression, um, it is true that medication can get a person to a healthy way of thinking and feeling much quicker than psychotherapy. So for instance, in the first month of intervention, medication tends to be 70% effective, and this is a large group of studies throughout the United States, whereas psychotherapy is only 40% effective, but used together, it's 85% effective. And over the course of the 6 months, medication will slip to 60% and psychotherapy will come up to 60%. So a 6-month intervention, they're about par. So a mild depression or anxiety, psychotherapy really is a reasonable and probably a healthy choice if there's not a crisis. But when you get to moderate or severe depression, the science really is unequivocal that by doing those things together, you're far more likely to get out of distress and into a safe and healthy mindset. Another thing that's very protective, whether we're talking about normal coping and adapting to crisis that is kind of in healthy proportions, whether we're talking about somebody who's acute and in distress, it's what we call affiliation. It's the people with whom we feel a connection, that we spend time with them, that we feel supported. And this is kind of, in some ways, from my perspective, this is one of the strange paradoxes about COVID-19, is that in the past 4 or 5 months, I've had so many families tell me that, yes, this is a scary time, and we don't know what's going to be happening in terms of how we're going to organize ourselves as time goes on with the schools and how we work, and relationships that are hopefully supported through a virtual experience. But the time we spend with our families, where we're sitting down and we're talking more, we're maybe playing games, there's not quite so many things that we're doing, going from place to place, lessons and athletic events. And so people are spending more time just sitting down and talking. And this is very helpful, protective, and it can deepen relationships in a family if it's done the way we naturally know how to do it. Spend time talking, reading books, playing games, using puzzles. If you watch a little bit of television and you discuss what's on there with children, that's quite helpful. And it's even okay to have a very limited exposure to the crisis like COVID. But I would warn you, and through the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement and my work with disasters, with the Oklahoma City bombing and with 9/11, that families that turn on the television and have this kind of persistent saturation of crisis news reporting, which is often very, very activating, that can have a clear detrimental effect, not just on children, but on everyone. So my belief is that it's pretty easy with a 10 to 20 minute review, and not even every day, I can stay up to date for what the changes are. Things are not moving so fast that they're going to change within a day's news cycle and I'll miss out on something. So limiting the exposure to news coverage and material that can activate us and shifting to this affiliation relationship is a very powerful kind of healing activity. Another thing is adaptive coping. If I as a person or the family or someone we know, if we know, hey, when I do this activity, maybe it's that I go and exercise, maybe it's that I talk to certain people across the country, maybe it's that I go back and read material, stories that I've found particularly good, or I like this author and I take time to do things that I I really enjoy, that's part of how we regenerate our resiliency and our ability to cope with crises. Um, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And strangely enough, one of the things I teach the medical students and residents that I work with is nothing has ever happened in the past and nothing can happen in the future. The only place that we have any effectiveness and power in our lives is in the now. And this is where mindfulness is so powerful, because if we're in the now and we're able to find our center through things like breathing or thinking about what's important to us, we end up grounding our whole body, our nervous system, even our immune system, to where it's more effective. So taking time for yourself, it can be with prayer, it can be with meditation, it can be with just centering yourself, thinking about your breathing, thinking about the people who are important to you, but not necessarily focusing on problems. If problems begin to weigh you down in this protected time, it's best just to let them go and come back to a thought or feeling, an image, possibly a space that you like. If there was a vacation that you really enjoyed in the past where you felt yourself to be together, I can go to the woods or the beach or the mountains and think about what it's like to be there. Or maybe there's a safe place in my home or my community I can think about, or I might even choose to visit that if it's COVID safe. So putting all that together, I do want to spend a little bit of time focusing on the elderly, because elderly can easily be isolated. So families who have older individuals, grandparents who are not going out because they tend to be much more cautious, and who don't necessarily live with very many people. Some might even live alone. The time that they're talking on the phone and doing FaceTime with people they love, talking about positive things or positive coping, can be profoundly changing for an elderly person. So reaching out, also helping them to problem solve what they might do. As we get older, our ability to problem solve and think clearly is more challenged. So how do I get my medications? How do I get my food? How do I stay connected to the people I care about? And many elderly people are not as likely to initiate that as they are delighted to get that call. And I will also tell you, if those calls can be predictable with a certain frequency, it might be once a week, it might be every other day, it may be for 15 minutes every morning. But if it's consistent and predictable, it's much more soothing and helpful. So I'm actually going to give another talk here as part of State of Mind, talking about kind of strategies to deal with, care for the caregivers. How do we care for ourselves? But it's also worth mentioning that 1 in 5 and MindPeace are doing a whole series on the state of mind. And so there's many talks that I think are well worth your time and energy. I really want to thank you for taking the time for spending this together, thinking about this. If you should want to give feedback or suggestions, I'm sure there's a lot that I've left out, but I want to make this kind of concise, give you time to think about these things, let them steep, but also think about what you know about your lives and the lives of people around you, because I might mention a number of things, but if you have a specific knowledge about someone, that may be quite profound. Thank you very much. I hope all goes well for you all, and God bless you.
A special thank you to our State of Mind speakers and to you for joining us. More videos and educational resources can be found at 1 in 5's website. If you feel like you or your child is in need of professional support, therapists are available. Please refer to MindPeace's school-based or community resource page. For a mental health crisis or emergencies, patients and families are encouraged to contact their current mental health provider first. This allows the mental health provider who knows your child best to provide support and direction. If your child does not have a mental health provider and they are experiencing a non-life-threatening mental health crisis, you are encouraged to contact the Psychiatric Intake Response Center at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. 513-636-4124. Call 911 or go to the emergency department if you are experiencing a medical emergency, a life-threatening mental health crisis, or are directed to go there by a medical provider. This will help limit the spread of COVID-19 in our community and allow our emergency departments to care for patients with the most critical needs first.